Last time, we told you about the most expensive war in the history of technology. A war between two companies that built each other up and then tried to tear each other apart. Over 50 lawsuits, 20 countries, $1 billion verdict, and the shocking twist that while their lawyers were destroying each other in courtrooms, their engineers were still working together in secret. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, go watch it right now. The link is on your screen. Because what we are about to tell you will hit harder once you understand where this war started. But for those of you who are already caught up, here is the thing no one told you. Apple and Samsung have been so consumed fighting each other that they both missed the same threat. A threat that didn't come from Silicon Valley. It didn't come from Tokyo. It didn't come from Seoul. It came from a small office in Beijing, where a 40-year-old software veteran sat down with 6 engineers, a pot of congee, and one idea that was about to change the entire world. His name was Lei Jun, and what he built would eventually force both Apple and Samsung to rethink everything. This is not just a story about phones. This is a story about how a third power rose in silence while the two giants were too busy destroying each other to notice. This is the story of the invisible invasion. And by the time you finish this video, you will never look at your smartphone the same way again. To understand what Xiaomi actually is, you need to understand what it decided not to be. It did not decide to compete on marketing budgets. Apple spends billions on advertising every single year. Samsung is one of the largest advertisers on the planet, spending over $10 billion a year on marketing at its peak. Xiaomi, in its early years, spent almost nothing. It did not decide to compete on physical stores. Apple has some of the most profitable retail spaces in the world. Samsung has distribution networks spanning every continent. Xiaomi, when it launched, had no stores at all. And it did not decide to compete on premium pricing. Apple's entire business model is built on selling fewer devices at higher margins. Samsung straddles every price tier. Xiaomi chose to do something that the industry thought was borderline insane: sell flagship-level hardware at near zero profit margins. The question was never, how do we beat Apple and Samsung at their own game? The question was, how do we make those two companies irrelevant to 1 billion people who can't afford to play that game at all? And that is exactly what they did. April 6th, 2010, Beijing, China. A small office in Zhongguancun, China's version of Silicon Valley. 13 people sit around a table. The atmosphere is tense, focused, electric. And on that day, with nothing more than a shared vision and a pot of rice porridge, Xiaomi Corporation is officially born. Lei Jun, the man at the center of it all, is not some fresh-faced dropout. He is a 40-year-old industry veteran who had already built and sold companies, led major IPOs, and become one of China's most respected angel investors. He had backed social media platforms, software companies, and emerging tech startups. He had already achieved financial freedom by any reasonable definition. He didn't have to do this. He chose to. The idea he had was deceptively simple. What if you could build a smartphone with the same specs as a Samsung Galaxy or an iPhone, but sell it at half the price? Not as a cheap knockoff, not as a compromise, but as a full premium product. Just without the bloated margins, the celebrity endorsements, the expensive retail stores, and the colossal advertising budgets that inflate the price of every device those two giants sell. The industry told him it was impossible. Supply chain giants refused to meet with him. Hardware engineers thought he was delusional. Traditional phone manufacturers laughed at the concept. But Lei Jun had one insight that nobody else in the room had. He understood that in the internet age, you don't need to build a product and then find customers. You build a community first, and then you ask them what they want. Before Xiaomi made a single smartphone, it built a software system. It was called MIUI, a customized version of Android, launched in August 2010 and released on online forums for tech enthusiasts to download, test, and modify. No advertising, no press releases, just a piece of software dropped into the internet and an open invitation for anyone who cared to help make it better. The response was unlike anything the industry had ever seen. Within months, hundreds of thousands of users were logging on every week to submit bug reports, request features, and debate design decisions. Xiaomi's engineers were on the forums day and night, responding directly to users, sometimes fixing bugs within hours of them being reported. Lei Jun called the first 100 people who engaged with MIUI the 100 Dream Sponsors. They weren't customers, they were co-creators. And they felt ownership over what was being built, which meant that when Xiaomi finally launched a physical phone, those 100 Dream Sponsors became 500,000 true believers who were ready to buy the moment the device went on sale. On August 16, 2011, Lei Jun walked onto a stage at Beijing's 798 Art District. He was wearing a simple black t-shirt and jeans, deliberately echoing the image of Steve Jobs, a man he openly admired, a man he had studied obsessively. He had named his own team the Madhouse for the 6 weeks leading up to the launch, because the preparation had been so intense. And when he revealed the price of the Xiaomi Mi 1, flagship specifications, Qualcomm's top processor, a full gigabyte of RAM, priced at 1,999 yuan, which was roughly $310 at the time, the crowd fell completely silent for 3 full seconds. Then it erupted into applause that lasted half a minute. 300,000 units were pre-ordered in the next 34 hours. The initial batch of units sold out in under 3 hours. The industry was watching, and it still didn't take it seriously. That was a mistake, because what happened next unfolded with a speed that had no precedent in the smartphone industry. By 2014, just 3 years after its first phone, Xiaomi had surpassed Samsung to become the best-selling smartphone brand in China, the single largest smartphone market on Earth. By April 2014, the company sold 2.1 million smartphones online in a single day, setting a world record. By the end of that year, Xiaomi had a valuation of over $46 billion, making it the most valuable technology startup in the world. Not in China, in the world. And then, with the momentum of a freight train, Xiaomi went global. India first, then Southeast Asia, then Europe, then Latin America, then Africa. In India specifically, Xiaomi's story reads like a military campaign. It entered the market in 2014 with the Redmi 1S, using the same flash sale model that had worked in China. Limited quantities, online only, lightning-fast sellouts, viral word of mouth. By 2018, Xiaomi had become the top-selling smartphone brand in India, knocking Samsung off a throne it had held for years. It opened 500 Mi stores in India in a single day, a move that earned it a Guinness World Record for the most retail stores opened simultaneously. This was not incremental disruption. This was a complete structural assault on the existing order. But here is where this story becomes truly extraordinary, and where the connection to Apple and Samsung becomes impossible to ignore. In 2019, the United States government made a decision that would accidentally hand Xiaomi the biggest gift it had ever received. The target wasn't Xiaomi. The target was Huawei. Huawei at that point was the most dangerous threat in the smartphone industry. In the second quarter of 2019, Huawei had briefly overtaken Samsung to become the world's largest smartphone seller, a feat that almost no one believed possible just 2 years earlier. Huawei had built extraordinary hardware, invested heavily in camera technology that rivaled and sometimes surpassed the iPhone, and had a distribution network that covered every corner of the planet. And then, on May 15, 2019, the Trump administration added Huawei to the Commerce Department's entity list. Overnight, Huawei lost access to Google's Android ecosystem, which meant no Gmail, no Google Maps, no YouTube, no Google Play Store. It lost access to TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor foundry that manufactured its most advanced chips. It lost access to Qualcomm processors, ARM architecture licenses, and virtually every critical technology it needed to compete internationally. Huawei's global smartphone market share collapsed from nearly 18% in mid-2019 to 4% by the third quarter of 2020. A company that had been weeks away from global domination was reduced to selling phones without Google apps, a death sentence for any device outside of China. By 2021, Huawei had dropped entirely out of the global top 5 smartphone manufacturers. But nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum, and the market share that Huawei lost had to go somewhere. It went to Xiaomi. In the third quarter of 2020, as Huawei's shipments collapsed by tens of millions of units, Xiaomi's shipments rose by tens of millions of units in the exact same markets: Southeast Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, Eastern Europe. The correlation was direct, immediate, and massive. For the first time in its history, Xiaomi overtook Apple in global smartphone shipments in that quarter. This was not a fluke. This was not a rounding error. This was the moment that the industry understood Xiaomi had arrived. Not as a budget option, not as a compromise, as a genuine global power. Now, this is the moment I want you to stop and subscribe, because what comes next is the part that Apple and Samsung do not want you to understand. Hit subscribe and make sure the bell is on, because we are just getting started. Let's talk about what Xiaomi actually is in 2025. Because if you still think of it as a phone company, you are about 15 strategic pivots behind. Xiaomi now operates across smartphones, wearables, smart home devices, tablets, laptops, electric vehicles, and its own semiconductor development. Its HyperOS software platform, which replaced MIUI in late 2023, now unifies over 786 million connected devices globally, from phones to air conditioners to electric cars to robot vacuums. Xiaomi has built what the industry calls an ecosystem, but not the closed premium ecosystem that Apple has perfected. Xiaomi's ecosystem is open, affordable, and designed to be accessible to the 80% of the world that cannot afford Apple prices. In 2024, Xiaomi shipped 168.5 million smartphones, placing it solidly in third position globally, with nearly 14% of the market. It was the fastest growing major smartphone brand that year, with growth of over 12% year on year. Its revenue reached the equivalent of approximately $50 billion across all divisions, and it spent $3.7 billion on research and development in 2024 alone, a 24% increase from the previous year. And then, in March 2024, Lei Jun walked onto a stage in Beijing for what he described as the last major entrepreneurship challenge of his life. He unveiled the Xiaomi SU7, a fully electric vehicle built entirely by Xiaomi from scratch. The crowd went silent. The specs appeared on screen: faster than a Porsche Taycan in acceleration, longer range than a Tesla Model S, and priced 30,000 yuan below a Tesla Model 3. Within 4 minutes of the order counter going live, 10,000 orders had been placed. Within 27 minutes, 50,000 orders. Within 24 hours, over 88,000 reservations. Lei Jun had not just built a phone company, he had built a technology empire. And he had done it by selling things at prices that made Apple and Samsung's business models look, to billions of people, almost grotesque in their excess. But let's be honest about the full picture, because this story is more nuanced than a simple David beats Goliath narrative. Xiaomi's margins are razor thin. Its business model of near zero hardware profit depends on recouping revenue through internet services, advertising on its devices, and IoT subscriptions. This works at massive scale, but it leaves almost no room for error. Apple, by contrast, generates margins on its hardware that Xiaomi literally cannot afford to dream about. Apple's gross margins on the iPhone have historically ranged between 35% and 45% per device. Xiaomi has publicly committed to never exceeding 5% profit on hardware. These are not just different strategies, they are fundamentally different theories of what a technology company is for. Apple's theory: build the best possible product, charge what it is worth, and create an ecosystem so deeply embedded in people's lives that they never want to leave. The result is a customer lifetime value that is extraordinary. An iPhone user who also buys an Apple Watch, subscribes to Apple Music, uses iCloud, watches Apple TV Plus, and pays for Apple Care is worth far more to Apple than the price of any single device. Xiaomi's theory: build the best possible product, charge as little as possible, get it into as many hands as you can, and build a digital life ecosystem around people who were previously invisible to the premium tech industry. The result is a user base that is enormous, diverse, and growing in regions where Apple and Samsung are either too expensive or culturally distant. These two theories are not just different, they are aimed at two almost entirely different populations of the planet. And that is the most important strategic truth of the entire Apple versus Samsung versus Xiaomi story. For all the lawsuits, all the patents, all the market share data, all the quarterly reports, the deeper truth is that Apple and Samsung have been fighting over approximately 20 to 25% of the world's smartphone buyers. The people who can afford premium devices, who live in wealthy markets, who have the disposable income to spend $800 to $1,500 on a phone every 2 years. The other 75 to 80% of the world's smartphone buyers, Apple and Samsung have never truly competed for them. They've never had to. Their business models were never designed for it. Xiaomi was. And so were Oppo, Vivo, and Transsion, the Chinese brand that most Americans have genuinely never heard of, but which shipped over 106 million devices in 2024, capturing nearly 9% of the global market by focusing almost exclusively on Africa, where it now holds over 45% of the entire continent's smartphone market. Let that number settle in for a moment. A single Chinese brand you've probably never heard of controls nearly half of the African smartphone market. Africa, a continent of 1.4 billion people, the fastest growing consumer market in the world, the region with the youngest population on Earth. Apple has almost no presence there. Samsung has a limited one. The Chinese brands own it. And this is where the story of the Apple versus Samsung war, the one we told you in part 1, suddenly looks very different. They spent 7 years and hundreds of millions of dollars fighting each other over rounded corners and bounce-back scroll effects. Meanwhile, a new generation of technology companies, hungrier, faster, more willing to operate on thin margins, and completely fluent in the needs of markets that Apple and Samsung had ignored, was quietly building a global infrastructure that neither giant had seen coming. In 2025, according to the latest available market data, Apple leads the global smartphone market with roughly 26% share. Samsung holds approximately 21%. Xiaomi sits in third at around 14%. But the trajectory lines tell a different story than the current snapshot. Apple and Samsung's combined share has been gradually declining for a decade. The Chinese brands, in aggregate, have been rising. And the competitive battleground is shifting again. Artificial intelligence is now the defining battleground of the smartphone industry. Every major manufacturer is racing to embed on-device AI into its hardware. AI cameras, AI assistants, AI-generated content tools, AI health monitoring. Apple has its own silicon and its own AI infrastructure. Samsung has a partnership with Google and its own Galaxy AI suite. Xiaomi is investing billions in AI research and has already integrated AI capabilities across its HyperOS platform. The question of who wins this AI race will determine who controls the smartphone market for the next decade. And none of the current leaders are guaranteed anything. Here's what you need to take away from both parts of this story. Apple and Samsung fought one of the most expensive, dramatic, and exhausting wars in business history. They spent 7 years and enormous resources trying to destroy each other in courtrooms. They manipulated evidence. They fought in 20 countries. They appealed every decision. They never truly won. And while they were doing all of that, while their lawyers were billing thousands of dollars an hour, and their PR teams were managing crisis after crisis, a company that started with 13 people and a pot of congee in Beijing quietly became the third largest smartphone manufacturer on Earth. Xiaomi didn't need a patent war. It didn't need a thermonuclear declaration. It didn't need a single lawsuit. It just needed a billion people who had been told for years that the best technology in the world was not for them. And it told them, actually, it is. Here it is. and it costs $310. That is the story that the history books will remember when they write about this era. Not the billion-dollar verdict in San Jose, not the Supreme Court reversal, not the confidential settlement. The real story is that while the two biggest companies in the world were looking at each other, they forgot to look at everyone else. So what happens next? Apple is doubling down on its ecosystem, pushing deeper into services, health technology, spatial computing, and artificial intelligence. Its margins remain extraordinary, and its brand loyalty remains unmatched. Samsung is fighting on every front simultaneously. Premium flagships, foldable phones, semiconductor manufacturing, AI integration, trying to be all things to all markets, while Xiaomi and its Chinese competitors undercut it at every price tier. And Xiaomi just launched an electric car that sold out in 4 minutes. It is building its own chips. It has an AI platform that spans 786 million connected devices. And its founder, Bois, the man his fans call China's Steve Jobs, Bois says this is only the beginning. The war between Apple and Samsung never really ended. It just got more complicated. And the most dangerous player in the room is the one that neither of them saw coming. If you want us to go even deeper into the AI race, the electric vehicle battle, and the chip makers that will determine who wins the next decade of technology, comment below right now. Type part 3 in the comments. If this video gets enough responses, we will drop the next episode within the week. Subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this story is already being written. And trust me, you are going to want to be there when it drops.